York. Unique New York. Unique New York. Okay, I'm ready.
Coming soon to Disney Plus. 2 all-new Pixar series, Dream Productions and Win or Lose.
Welcome to headquarters. This is where Riley's emotions work.
From the world of Inside Out comes Dream Productions.
So the writer and director of Dream Productions is Mike Jones, who's our next guest. And another bit preamble. In the spirit of full disclosure, Mike is a longtime friend. He's one of IndieWire's earliest supporters, and we met when I hired him at Variety during the 2007 writer's strike. I'm also mentioning that because while I totally didn't realize it at the time, that role also reflected the adaptability that has allowed him to succeed in Hollywood. He's now a writer-director at Pixar, whose credits include co-writing Luca and Soul, and he was on the senior creative teams for Incredibles 2, Toy Story 4, and Inside Out 2. And on December 11th, we will see the launch of the Disney Plus TV show he wrote and directed, Dream Productions. And it's set in the world of Inside Out. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Jones.
Hi. God, I'm nervous. I'm so nervous.
I find it incredibly apropos that you're our first guest at our first Future of Filmmaking Summit. It's I couldn't have asked for a better one. Yeah, and it's also just great to see you again because it's been a while. I want to start at the very beginning in Texas, which is where I'm from as well. But you grew up around San Antonio, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to guess that there was not a lot of instinct to go into entertainment there.
No, there wasn't. I also just want to say how wonderful it is to see IndieWire here. IndieWire started with Eugene Hernandez, Mark Rabinowitz, and a couple of others in the DGA building on 57th Street, out of the Filmmaker magazine offices, by the way. And Filmmaker magazine is still such a great magazine. If you don't subscribe, please. It's just so fantastic to see IndieWire here. This is just wild for me. Like, we had no money, zero money. Now we have graphics and stuff. That's great. That's really great. No, I grew up in San Antonio. Being in the film industry was not an option. I grew up around movies. I went to school to be an English teacher because I like stories, and that was the closest thing to story and a career I thought I could get to. But I think it was, I went to the University of North Texas in Denton, and I fell in with a bunch of people that were watching art films. I didn't grow up with art films. There was really no art theater in San Antonio at the time.
What was the first art film you remember?
Probably 8½. I mean, seeing 8½, just blew my mind because I hadn't recognized that you can do movies in that way, right? And that kind of actually led me to, more the late 60s era of American filmmaking. And I saw Tender Mercies, and Tender Mercies was a movie about my family in a way. And I didn't know that you could make movies about my family, which was filled with drama. My dad went to prison when I was in high school. I grew up with just constant, nonstop drama. I didn't think any of that would be interesting until I started to see those movies and then got involved in the indie film world in New York in the mid-90s, really.
So how did you get, so you were at University of North Texas, did they even have a film program at the time?
Not really, they had a little
They do
bit
now,
of
but.
I felt, so this group of people that I started to hang out with, they decided to apply to film school, and I got into NYU. And so I just decided I'm going to throw everything I have to go into NYU. And I paid off those loans for 10 years maybe. It was, but I wanted to be a cinematographer. And that's when, going to NYU I enrolled there in '92, and then I stayed in New York for about 10 years. It was such a great, time to be in New York City and to work in an independent film in the mid-90s. I loved that time, yeah.
So you graduate from NYU. At that point, do you still want to be a cinematographer?
No, that's one of my writing teachers pulled me aside and said, you write pretty well, you ought to think about writing. And that kind of got in my head, and so I just started to write scripts. And again, it was that whole movement about that maybe people would be interested in the kinds of characters that I grew up around, which was kind of still just a new concept to me. As soon as I started to write those characters in these scripts, that's when I started to get a little bit of notice. And it took about 10 years, I guess, outside of school to finally kind of get a foothold as a working screenwriter.
So what year did you graduate?
I graduated 94.
94, okay.
Yeah.
So tell us, like, what were you doing at that point? It's like, when did you started working at one point at Filmmaker? Was that right after graduation?
No, I bounced around to a bunch of jobs. I worked at CS First Boston, which was a giant investment bank where I just stole everything I could out of that place. I mean, everything I could. I was the media services coordinator, which means like I got to videotape all the meetings and stuff like that, and like I would just find different ways of stealing from them. I loved it. I copied scripts. Oh, that copier was mine. And I just because it was before email, you just sent it everywhere, and of course nobody would read it. That's the thing. That's another thing. I would write these scripts and I would just blindly kind of send them out, not unlike just blindly emailing them out to people.
How did you even know where to send them at that point?
Well, the IFP, I got a lot of resources from the IFP. The IFP, I think, when they had the independent feature film market in New York, they would publish this book that had like all the addresses of agents and distributors and production companies, and I would just go I would just blindly just send them out. I mean, nobody was reading it, And so I wasn't really getting anywhere there. And so I started to finally end up working at Filmmaker. I started to kind of, have a more full-time job within the industry, and I was still writing, but nobody was reading my stuff. And I just decided I'm gonna go make it, because that's what Filmmaker Magazine and IndieWire was all about. It was about this is how you can make your own movie. And so I said, well, this is, I think it was my 4th or 5th script. I said, I'm just going to make it. And I think the thing I figured out is if I can get some cast attached, then we can get off the ground. And so we sent it we got Chris Cooper attached. Oh, it was a script called Miller, and it was based on my dad. My dad went to prison when I was in high school. And my mom had moved away and remarried, and I was kind of on my own. And my dad got out of prison, and I had held down 2 jobs and just was waiting for him to get out so I can help him get back on his feet. He was a real estate broker, got out of prison, lost his real estate license, and came out a really changed man. And I loved my father deeply, and he loved both me and my sister deeply. And so that's the script I wrote. I wrote a script based on him, based on the way he spoke, and based on the way he kind of held his emotions in, and the way he changed. And that script got Chris Cooper attached, we got Marcia Gay Harden attached, we got Scarlett Johansson attached. She was just a teenager back then. And it was never made. You'll never see it. But because there was this energy behind it that lifted the script out from just being a concept to being something that's gonna happen. And that's when I got my representation.
How did you get them attached?
Casting director. So I got a producer, Renee Bastian, who produced LIE and a bunch of other little indies at the time. He had a relationship with Carrie Barden and Mark Bennett, who were 2 great casting directors in New York at the time. I think they're both here now. And they said, "What's your ideal cast?" And I said, "Chris Cooper." And then Marcia Gay Harden. This is before they both won Oscars. And then they won Oscars. And of course, that's how long we had Money in the Bank twice. It fell out both times. And at some point, though, I just kind of had to give it up. It would be, 6 years and it hadn't been made. But I got representation, and then I was able to start getting work as a screenwriter.
And so at that point, though, so you started getting work as a screenwriter, but were those films made?
No. No. And, that's the interesting part. I feel I wanted to be a screenwriter. And when I was coming here, I was flying in and doing meetings. I wasn't getting any work from any of them, but I was getting meetings based on these kind of little indie art films that I was writing, all kind of based on South Texas in a way. And I said, well, nobody is going to make those, obviously, so I'll just write I'll just write what I think they want me to write, right? It's kind of the one for them, one for me fallacy, where I go, well, if I think my first big studio job was I pitched a giant fighting robot movie. This is before what's Real Steel? Way before Real Steel. I pitched it to Columbia. I said and it was just a silly idea about these people that would make these giant robots and fight for pink slips, right? And it's just, I shouldn't have written it. But I got paid, I sold it, right? And Stan Winston Productions, I don't know if you remember Stan Winston. He had a deal at Columbia. I sold it to him, and we sold it then to Columbia. And then I was writing this thing. And I will tell you, I had no business writing that. Because I had this thing in my mind that they're not interested in my indie film characters. They're interested in more kind of a higher common denominator 4-quadrant movie, and that's very different than what I write. And so that one for me, one for them idea that I spent years writing, you can tell the scripts that were shit and the scripts that would never get made. They were both. The one for them would never get made. The one for and were shit. And the one for me were pretty good, but they would never get made. And it took me a really long time to figure out how to write the characters that I knew how to write into higher concepts, into genres, really. And as soon as I figured that out, that's when my career kind of went to the next level.
So what was the thing that kind of twigged you to like, okay, this is how you meld and weld those two things together?
Yeah, there was a book called The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break. And it was in my manager's office, and it was on the cover of this book was the Minotaur sitting on a pickle bucket with a cigarette in his hand and his head in the other, and out by the dumpsters between shifts, And the book is about the Minotaur as like kind of a shell of the monster he used to be. And it's been 4,000 years out of the labyrinth, and he's had a really rough go of it. And I looked at that character, and I go like, I know that character. Like, I know how that feels. I know how it feels to like smoke at 18, like between shifts, and how great that cigarette is. And I said, I can write that character. And I ended up reading the book and changing a lot of the plot. But that's where I started to put a lot of those characters that I loved, that I grew up around, that I was in a way, into something more genre-based, right? And that was essentially a love story. Because at the end of the day, what's the Minotaur is that he's kind of the object of all alpha male aggression. Like every time some stupid ex-jock sees the Minotaur, they want to go like push his buttons. And what does the Minotaur do? Well, he's going to blow up and eat them, right? So this guy doesn't want to do that anymore, so he gets in his station wagon and he drives to the next town and gets like another short order grill cook job until somebody starts pushing his buttons. But the story was about him falling in love with a waitress. And the waitress falls in love with him, and he says, like, you know what, I'm going to stick it out. And sure enough, the head chef starts to push his buttons. So it's this kind of love story that had this kind of wonderful character at the center of it. That was also had these wonderful fantasy genre elements, because he's not the only mythological creature working shit jobs in this world. And I just thought it was great. And that script got me into Pixar. That script got me so much work. Again, you'll never see it. You'll never see it made. It's had directors come and go. I mean, I say that right now. It's been optioned to somebody else. It won't get made. I mean, it's good. I reread it. It's okay. But it's that idea, right? So that's when I figured out, I can put these characters that I know how to write into larger ideas. And that's what Pixar wants. Yeah.
So I'm going to spend a good chunk of time in Pixar, but before we do, real quick, I want to just talk about the time when I met you during the writer's strike and Europe Variety. Did you, because when you came into that role, I was just glad to have you. I mean, I thought you were a great hire, but were you anxious about losing your footing as a screenwriter?
Yeah. I mean, it was the writer. So just before that, we were living in New York. I felt I was a working screenwriter, and that means I was able to write a spec, get some more work. That work would never get made. My stock would fall a little bit. I would write another spec. Suddenly that spec would get me more work. So it was these kind of highs and lows. And I could make a little bit of money, I could pay the rent and keep food in the refrigerator, but then that money would run out. And so I would desperately try to find like something else. And so we had my first son, and we decided to move to LA from New York. And as soon as we moved, that was 2006. And then the writer's strike happened maybe 6 months later. And everything that I had set up like faded away. And so that's when you met me. It was gone. And we had like maybe we had $200 in the bank. I think Eugene Hernandez like set us up, and yep. So in Variety, I was hired as the managing editor of film festivals. It was just the greatest job. It was the greatest job. And I remember like my interview with you and Peter Bart, and working for Peter Bart. Like we could do a whole panel about working for Peter Bart. Man, he yelled at me. But I also loved him. I mean, I don't know if you know Peter Bart. Peter Bart ran Paramount. With
Robert.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Robert Evans.
Thank you.
Anyway, and he ran Variety like he ran a studio. It was great. I loved working for Peter Bart, and so to get that job, I said, like, look, I think film festivals are essentially kind of our art galleries of films. Like it's where curation
Which is still true.
happens. It's still true. Yeah. I feel like even more so. In this day, curation is so important because there's so much content out there, right? And that's what film festivals kind of do. They kind of help you do it. So that's how we approached it. We did a whole blog with the circuit.
Yep.
Remember the circuit?
Yep.
Yeah. Also, like 2 years. So I guess to answer your question, as soon as I kind of got in there, I stopped writing. I loved like being at Variety. I loved like interviewing filmmakers. I loved going to film festivals. I loved that Variety was paying me to go to film festivals. Yeah. And you know the first guy they're going to lay off is the guy that's going to the film festivals. And the company dime. Yeah.
Yeah. There were a lot of layoffs that were going on around then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you kind of regain your mojo and screenwriting at that point?
Well, I think it was there that kind of desperate attempt to figure out who I was as a writer and how I was going to figure out or put the things that I knew how to write into things that people wanted to make. And that's just a constant evolution in my head all throughout those years. And that's when I wrote The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break. I just felt I don't want to go back into this cycle of writing a little small indie, having that read, getting a bunch of assignments, whether it's rewrite work or adaptations of books and stuff like that, and none of them happening, my stock kind of falling again, writing another little, art indie film, which I wrote a lot of those. Again, it's like one for me, one for them. I was in that, before Variety, I was in that pattern. And so Minotaur really helped kind of shake that up, and I think it was 2 years after, was it 2 years after the Variety that I got my first Pixar job writing for Henry Selick, at the time.
So what year was that, 2011, 10, something like that?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. So talk about what the Pixar experience was like from when you start at the level of, okay, we're going to hire you to help write this thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Pixar doesn't hire animation writers. They hire writers that know how to string a story together. They hire writers that know drama. Pixar can make anything funny and beautiful and just stunning looking, but what they need help and why they hire a lot of writers, and they used to hire a lot of writers out of Sundance, they need people that can help kind of keep the whole arc of character in their heads. And so that's what they look for. And so when I went there, I had kind of come out of this period where, I've been saying no to a lot of stuff. Because I started to understand that this concept is not going to work with the characters that I like to write. Pixar, when I went into Pixar said like, no, we want those characters. We want you in these movies. We don't want you to kind of fall back on stuff that we've done or stuff that we've seen before. We are looking for something unique, and we're looking for characters that people can fully believe in. And if you think of all these Pixar movies, that's what they do. I mean, all Pixar movies, the secret to Pixar is really, I'll tell you what the real secret is. The real secret is Pixar makes and shoots the movie over and over again for 5 years. So if you can do that in a live-action movie, I mean, Boyhood is a great example of a movie that's just constantly. If you can do that in a live-action movie, you'll probably find your movie. Well, that's what Pixar kind of can afford to do. We reshoot the movie again and again and again, right? And it's all about character. Pixar can animate a movie from start to finish in about 9 months. But all of those years before are just trying to figure out the story, right? And that's where the writer and the director then are kind of attached at the hip, and you become kind of like a therapist to the director, and you just sit in a room and you just try to figure it out, and you maybe get one shot at writing a script, and then after that, the script is chopped up into 5-page segments, and then a whole team of story artists comes in, they start drawing, and then you're never really writing a full script again. You're only writing in segments. So they need writers that can keep the whole movie in their head like an editor. Yeah.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about the collaboration aspect of Pixar. I mean, it's like, God, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could all live our lives that way, where we could just rewrite over and over again until we get it right?
Well, it also requires you to kind of leave your ego out the door a little bit, because you know, as a screenwriter before that for about less than 20 years, I was mostly by myself in my office, wherever that happened to be, behind a door, figuring it out. And at Pixar, they never let you figure it out by yourself. There's always somebody that knocks on the door and goes like, hey, what are you working on? Can we read it? Like, will you read it to us? It's a constant pitch. It's always pitching. It's always pitching to artists. It's always pitching to directors, to executives. It's run by Pete Docter, probably one of the greatest American directors working. You have to pitch like a filmmaker to him, right? And he's not an executive necessarily. He's a filmmaker. And so I worked very closely with him on Soul. And whenever I would go out and think of something that I loved, I knew immediately I would need to go tell him as fast as I could, because I would sometimes just love it so much and I would hate to get a no. And so I need to get that no pretty quickly so I can kind of move on to something else. Or I can get like a yes and add this, or what about this, right? So it just teaches you that this idea of the auteur, while important and while there is, on all the projects I've been on at Pixar, there is certainly a creative head. You are so reliant on the rest of all of those artists. I mean, Pixar employs some of the greatest artists in the world. And so when we did Dream Productions is an interesting, we could talk about that. But,
please do, yeah.
So Dream Productions is essentially an 82-minute movie, but it's 4 episodes. I had to think of it like a movie. And it was also, we had to do it at a much lower price point than a typical Pixar movie. While it's a pretty major company, it can only, because it spends so much time on these movies, it can't afford to do too much at once. It can really only afford to focus on 1 or 2 things. And so when Disney wanted us to do streaming, it was suddenly inserting something else in there. The Netflix adjustment correction, right, happened, and everybody felt that. Disney Plus felt that, we felt that. But also, every Pixar movie is on fire at some point. And you go, how is it not working? How are we in such trouble here? It usually has to do with kind of what that final gesture of the movie is, right? Or maybe we haven't set up the character enough in that first act. All of those decisions, once you're into production, affect everybody down the line, right? And so it happens over and over and over again. So when something gets on fire, they kind of look at us and go well, you have a bunch of our people. We need all those people on this one right now. That happened a bunch of times, right? And so we would kind of let all of our people go and work, on Inside Out 2, on some other films that were in trouble, and just pray and hope that we would get them back. And we would eventually. And then we would quickly scramble and try to produce. I think, to pat myself on the back, I was able to figure out the story pretty quickly of Dream Productions. It was we really want, I don't want to give anything away, but our 4th episode is pretty astounding. And the crew rallied to make that 4th episode because we get to do something in the Inside Out world that Inside Out 1 or 2 didn't get to do. And we had the full support of Pete and everybody. So it was kind of that underdog feel where as soon as like we let our crew go to put out the fire on another film, we quickly grabbed them back and they wanted to come back and do it. So it was kind of, again, that kind of indie spirit in a way that I really loved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because we tend to think of something like Pixar that's a very big studio owned by a very big conglomerate. And, you know, as indies, it's like, anybody who's ever worked on an indie film knows what scrappy means. I mean, it's like every indie film is scrappier than you could possibly imagine. But what's interesting to me is that mindset still persists at Pixar.
Yeah. And I would not say Dream Productions is an independent film.
I know.
It was expensive as shit. I mean, no, it should not be judged as an indie film. It's like only within kind of the microcosm of Pixar. And Pixar is maybe, I think, probably the last animation studio in the United States. There's no more. Blue Sky that was in New York is gone. All of the animation is moving to Vancouver, or I think Skydance does their animation in Spain. Illumination does their animation in France. And it makes our films very expensive, but we want to keep all of that behind those gates. We don't want to send our stuff out and wait 2 or 3 days for it to be animated or laid out. For it to come back, we have to give notes, then it goes again. Like, it's so much time. Our directors really want to sit with those animators and adjust every single eyebrow lift or pinky movement. Like, all those things are really important to us. And that's why our films are expensive, really expensive.
So has there ever been pressure to say, well, why can't you just send it to Korea or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would seems like if that were the case, that would completely break down the system, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see how you would do that.
It would be a giant cultural hit on Pixar, and it just is not the way that we make movies. And it's something that we fought for, and something I think that we can point to our success for, right? I mean, Pixar is, aside from A24 to a certain extent, when you say this is a Pixar movie, people go like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And we're very, very proud of that, and we really try to protect that as much as we can.
Do you know what you're going to be doing next?
No. I'm kind of the person that when something is on fire, they put me in that fire. And so now that I know how to make a movie there and go through the pipeline, which is really specific, they know that they can kind of put me in and I can give kind of reasonable fixes to things because, as you can imagine, it's almost like a screenwriter, working on their own script and getting notes from executives is one thing, right. But a screenwriter trying to fix a scene while it's being shot is something else. And you have to have knowledge of that end of the production in order to do that job. I didn't have that for a long time. I kind of finally have it with Dream Productions. So that's I get put on to a lot of fires. And it's really hard, and I don't like it. It's really like, oh, really? Like, why did we get here? Why? Every single time. Yeah.
The danger of being good at it. So, for my last question, I find it so interesting that in terms of the progression of your career, you were in indie film when it was like really starting to, bust out, and when there started to be kind of the mystique around indie film in general, and also around not just like the one for me, one for them thing, but just like, okay, the only, the way to success is you've got to make your own film no matter what and get it into Sundance, and that's how it works. And Sundance is still an incredible film festival, the best film festival in America, but it is also, the world's changed a lot, since then.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what do you credit your ability to pivot? What do you think, because that's a powerful gravitational pull.
Right.
So what was able to make you say, okay, maybe that's not it for me?
Well, I had a bottle of champagne in my refrigerator that was purely going to be opened when I got into Sundance. Like, and that early on, when I was writing scripts, I go like, I am writing a script for Sundance, it's gonna get made, we're gonna screen at Sundance, it's gonna get bought, it's gonna be great, right? My whole idea of breaking into independent film, that was the model back then, right? And if it wasn't Sundance, it maybe was Cannes, maybe it was Toronto, maybe, you know. And that never happened, you know. And it was the Sundance Labs for before that, right? It was like, well, I'm gonna get it in the Sundance Labs, and then that'll get me money to make it into a movie, and then we're going to go to Sundance Film Festival. Like, it was just in the early '90s, Sundance had such an aura about it, and it was such a key to success. And they had such success in programming these fantastic movies, right? They still do. And so I think like I think it was again, I kind of go back to that one for them, one for me fallacy, where I felt that I started to make a living as a Hollywood screenwriter, and none of those scripts were ever getting made or even that good. And yet the other scripts I was writing, the smaller art films I was writing, those were good, but those would get me the Hollywood work. And I, for some reason, early on in my career, couldn't make the connection that what they want is that. They want that into what they're trying to make, right? They want that into like a witness protection story or whatever I was sent, whatever like, you know, like Hollywood 4-quadrant movie I was being sent. They would want those characters in that. I didn't think I could do it. I thought those two things were separate. And so again, like as soon as I figured out like the things that I write well can be put into these things, and that makes me excited to write them. And that makes the audience excited to watch them, because when you like again, and Pixar only wants that. Pixar only wants those characters that are so authentic and that you believe in so much that you'll follow that character through all their terrible decisions, right? That's what, and it took me years to figure that out. So it's really finding how to put myself into an area of the industry that I never thought I really belonged in. I thought I belonged in independent film. It's really, it really didn't turn out like that. And I love where I'm at right now, right?
Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.